All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into Azure API Design.
Sounds good.
You know, whether you're prepping for a meeting or just curious about API design,
Right.
this deep dive is going to be really useful.
Yeah.
So we're exploring this Azure API Design ebook.
Okay.
And let me tell you, it is full of practical advice on how to build software that's adaptable and flexible.
Yeah, it really is.
I'm excited to jump in.
Me too.
So one thing that really struck me about this ebook was how it relates API design to everyday concepts.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, we already organize the world around us into resources.
Right.
Think of things like orders, products, customers.
Exactly.
The ebook takes that same thinking and applies it to software,
Yeah.
which makes even complex systems feel more intuitive.
Yeah, it's a great approach.
I really like that.
Yeah.
So the ebook is really emphasizing the advantages of designing APIs well.
Uh-huh.
But why is that so important in the big picture?
Well, you get two main benefits from a good API design,
Okay.
platform independence, and service evolution.
All right, break those down for me. What do those even mean?
Well, platform independence basically means that any application can talk to your API,
Okay,
regardless of the tech it uses internally.
gotcha.
So it could be a website, a mobile app, anything. It can all communicate with your API because it's using those standardized protocols and data formats.
So it's like a universal language for software.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it breaks down those communication barriers between different parts of the digital world.
Like building bridges.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah.
So what about service evolution?
So that's about making sure your API can change over time,
Yeah,
grow, improve,
right.
without breaking everything that depends on it.
So you can add new features and fix bugs behind the scenes
Exactly.
without disrupting everyone using it.
It's like renovating a house without evicting the tenants.
I like that.
You're making changes, improving things,
Right.
but everyone's still able to live there.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, the ebook mentions this thing called Richardson's maturity model.
Uh-huh.
What is that exactly? Is it like a ranking system for APIs?
It's more of a way to figure out how restful an API really is.
Restful.
Yeah.
That's good for it.
Representational state transfer.
Right.
It's a popular style for designing web APIs.
Gotcha.
And it often uses HTTP as its base.
Okay.
So Richardson's model breaks REST down into levels.
Okay.
From level 0, which is basically just using post requests for everything,
Okay.
all the way to level 3,
Right.
which really embraces heady A's.
Oh,
We'll get to that later.
right.
But most APIs are somewhere around level 2,
Yep.
where they use standard HTTP methods
Right.
like get, post, put, and delete
Right.
to talk to resources in a consistent way.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So the ebook talks about thinking in resources when it comes to API design.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It's all about seeing your software as built from these blocks called resources. A resource can be any data, object, even a service in your system.
So like in that e-commerce example, customers, products, orders, these are all resources.
Exactly.
And then you structure your API around these resources.
Right.
That creates a really organized and intuitive system.
Exactly.
I see. So instead of having an API endpoint, like say create order,
Yeah.
you'd have something like orders.
Right.
And then you'd use different HTTP methods to say what you want to do with that order.
Exactly. You use nouns instead of verbs in your URIs.
Keeps things consistent.
Yeah, nice and clean.
I like it.
The ebook actually has this collection item collection guideline for structuring your URIs.
Okay.
So you might have customers
Right.
to show all the customers.
Gosh.
And then customers 5
Okay.
to get to a specific customer with the ID 5,
Right.
and then something like customers 5 orders.
To see all the orders for that customer,
Yeah,
it's like this hierarchy. It makes sense.
Yeah, it creates a really elegant structure.
It's starting to all click now. Where does HTTP fit into all of this?
Think of HTTP as the language your API uses.
Okay.
Those standard HTTP methods we talked about.
Like get T, post, put
Oh,
T,
yeah.
delete.
They all have a role in how you interact with resources.
So DET is for fetching data.
Right.
Tobos T for creating new resources.
Exactly.
PUT for updating or replacing them.
Yes.
PTCH is for making partial updates.
Mhm.
And delete, well, I think that one's pretty clear.
Yeah, that was pretty straightforward.
Okay, now it's all coming together.
Dude.
I gotta admit, though, sometimes I get posty, PUT, and PCH mixed up.
It happens.
What's the real difference? And
Yeah.
why not just use PSOS-T for everything?
That's a good question. A lot of people wonder that.
Yeah.
The key here is this concept called idempotency.
Idempotency.
It's a fancy word, but basically it means that if you do the same thing multiple times, you get the same result.
Okay.
So PUT requests, for example, they're idempotent.
Right.
If you send the same PUT request twice to update a resource, it'll always end up in the same state.
So PUT is like hitting save twice.
Exactly.
Your document doesn't change any further.
Right.
So you use PUT when you want those reliable updates. You want to make sure things are consistent, even if the request is accidentally sent multiple times.
Precisely.
So POST and PASCH are different then.
Yes.
They're not always idempotent.
Right.
POST is usually for creating new resources.
Mm-hmm.
And if you send the same POST request multiple times, you might end up with duplicates.
Like sending the same email twice?
Yeah, you get two copies.
Exactly.
PECH, on the other hand, that's for partial updates.
Right.
When you're changing just certain parts of a resource.
Precisely.
This is really helpful. I feel like I'm finally understanding these basics.
Awesome.
But I have a feeling there's a whole world beyond just these basic HTTP methods.
Oh, definitely.
What else do we need to consider when designing good APIs?
Well, we haven't even touched on media types.
Okay.
Like JSON or XML. Those define the format of the data you're sending back and forth.
Okay.
And then there are asynchronous operations,
Right.
where you don't want to keep the client waiting for a long task to finish.
Makes sense.
The eBook suggests using status codes like 202 accepted to handle those gracefully.
So it's like giving the client a progress report.
Exactly.
Like, hey, we're working on it.
Yeah, we're on it. Check back later.
Check back later for the results.
Exactly.
I like it.
And then there are practical things like filtering and pagination.
Okay.
Imagine dealing with huge amounts of data.
Right.
The eBook gives examples of using query parameters to filter orders, say by a minimum cost,
Gotcha.
or to limit the number of results you get back.
So you don't overload the client with information.
Right.
Makes sense.
And it even talks about supporting partial responses for really large resources,
Okay.
which can be super important for unreliable connections.
So if the connection drops, you don't have to start all over again. It's all about making the API efficient and user-friendly.
Precisely.
There's one term that's been in my head since we started. HADOACE.
Ah, yes.
It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does, doesn't it?
What is it?
So HADOACE stands for hypertext as the engine of application state.
Okay.
It's this really cool idea about creating self-describing APIs.
Self-describing.
So instead of making the client know all the possible URIs and actions in advance,
Right.
HADOACE embeds links within each resource representation.
What does that mean?
These links act like signposts.
Okay.
They guide the client on what they can do next.
So it's like each resource comes with its own instruction manual.
Exactly.
It tells the client what other resources are related and what actions they can take.
Precisely.
I like that.
Yeah, the eBook even includes a JSON example to show how these links work.
That's helpful.
It makes APIs super adaptable
How so?
because the clients don't have to be hard-coded with specific URIs. So if something changes, the API can just tell the client where to go.
This HADOACE concept is blowing my mind.
It's powerful stuff.
It sounds like it could really make client development easier
Definitely.
and make APIs more resilient to change.
Exactly.
But what about versioning?
Yeah.
How do we handle an API that's evolving over time?
Right.
We don't want to break all the client applications that might not be ready for the latest features.
Of course not.
So how do we do that?
Well, that's where versioning strategies come in.
Okay.
The eBook outlines a few different approaches,
Okay.
each with its own pros and cons.
Like what?
Well, we have URI versioning,
Okay.
query string versioning,
Gotcha.
header versioning, even media type versioning.
Wow. That's a lot.
It's about finding the balance between simplicity and maintainability
Right.
and how well each method works with HADOACE.
It's a lot to think about,
It is.
but it's really interesting stuff.
I agree.
So before we move on, I'm curious.
Yeah.
What stood out to you so far in this ebook?
I'm really struck by how much emphasis the eBook puts on the developer experience.
Okay.
It's not just about making APIs that are technically sound,
Right.
but also making them intuitive and predictable.
It's like this one's between navigating a well-organized library
Exactly.
versus digging through a messy attic.
You got it.
One's enjoyable, the other is just frustrating.
Exactly.
I love that analogy.
Thanks.
So a well-designed API is a happy API.
Yes.
Happy developers, happy users, everyone wins.
Exactly.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm going to touch on one last thing. The Open API Initiative. What's the significance of that?
Well, the Open API Initiative, which used to be called the Swagger Specification,
Right.
it's all about standardizing how we describe REST APIs.
Okay.
It's like creating a blueprint that everyone can understand.
So it's like a universal translator for APIs.
Exactly.
I like it.
This standardization makes it easier for developers to work together.
Because they're all speaking the same language. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you can use tools like Swagger to automatically generate documentation and client libraries from that open API definition.
So you don't have to start from scratch every time.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It's a huge time saver.
And the Open API initiative also advocates for this contract-first approach.
Right.
What does that mean?
That means you design the API's interface before you write any code.
So like having an architectural plan before building a house?
Exactly.
Figure out the layout before laying any bricks?
Precisely.
That helps prevent costly mistakes down the line.
Absolutely.
Makes a lot of sense.
Wow.
Wow, we've covered a ton of ground already.
We have.
And I feel like we're just getting started.
Yeah, there's a lot more to explore.
But we'll have to pause here for now.
Okay.
We'll dive even deeper into designing robust and scalable APIs in part 2.
Looking forward to it.
Stay tuned. Things are going to get even more interesting.
Definitely.
I'm excited.
Me too. Welcome back.
All right, so that whole idea of an API acting like a state machine, that's really stuck with me.
I know, right? It's fascinating.
It's like the software is taking you on a choose-your-own-adventure.
Exactly.
Revealing new options with each step.
It's a really cool way to think about it.
And when I first learned about Helios, it was like a light bulb moment.
It really changes how you approach API design.
Totally.
It makes the whole experience more interactive.
Right. Instead of having a fixed map,
Yeah.
the client just follows the links.
Exactly. It's more dynamic.
Much more flexible, adaptable.
Makes the applications easier to evolve, too.
Speaking of evolving,
Yeah.
how do we handle versioning when things inevitably change?
Right. We don't want to break all the client applications that depend on the API.
Exactly. Those developers worked hard.
Yeah, we got to be mindful of that.
So how do we do it? How do we manage versioning?
Well, the eBook lays out some different strategies.
Okay.
And it's important to remember there's no one perfect answer.
Right. Different situations, different solutions.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
So let's break down those different methods.
Okay.
What's the simplest one if you're starting from scratch?
Well, the simplest is actually no versioning at all.
Really?
But honestly, I wouldn't recommend it for most cases.
Right. I can see that causing problems.
It might work for small internal APIs
Okay.
where you have total control.
Okay.
But once you have external clients or a more complex system,
Yeah, you'll need versioning.
you're going to need it.
So what are our options if we decide versioning is a must?
One common way is URI versioning.
Okay.
You include the version number right in the URI.
So like V1 customers
Exactly.
and then V2 customers for version 2.
You got it.
Seems straightforward.
It is, but it can get messy if you have tons of versions.
Right. Lots of different URLs to keep track of.
Exactly. URL bloat.
And there's also the question of whether it's really the same resource with different URIs.
Good point. There's debate about that.
So what's another option?
You could use query string versioning.
Okay.
You add a version parameter to the query string.
So instead of V1 customers, it's like customers.version2.
Precisely.
Keeps the URI cleaner.
It does.
But then the server has to parse that query string.
That's right.
You mentioned earlier that some methods affect cache friendliness.
Yes.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure.
What does that even mean?
Well, URI versioning and query string versioning,
Uh-huh.
they're generally considered cache friendly.
Okay.
Because servers and proxies can easily cache those responses based on the URI.
Gotcha.
But header versioning and media type versioning,
Yeah.
those can complicate things.
How so?
They use custom headers or media types to show the version,
Right.
which requires more processing.
And that can mess with caching.
Exactly.
So it's a trade-off.
Right.
Simplicity versus potential performance hits. You also said that some people consider media type versioning the most pure, restful approach.
Yes, there's an argument for that.
Why is that?
Yeah. It aligns with content negotiation in HTTP.
Okay.
Clients say what format and version they prefer.
Using the accept header?
Exactly.
And the server responds accordingly.
With the content type header.
It's a more elegant way to do it.
It feels more natural within HTTP.
Like speaking the language.
Exactly.
But it still has its own considerations.
Oh, absolutely.
There are always trade-offs.
Always.
The ebook also points out some common mistakes developers make.
Oh, yeah, there are some classic pitfalls.
What are some of those gotchas to watch out for?
One big one is creating a chatty API.
Chatty.
Yeah, it's when you need lots of back and forth between the client and the server.
Okay.
Imagine having to make a separate request for every little piece of information. It's incredibly inefficient.
Especially with lots of traffic.
Exactly. It can really bog things down.
So the eBook recommends denormalizing data.
Yes, to reduce those round trips.
So it's like packing a suitcase efficiently.
I like that.
You don't want to keep running back and forth to the car for each item.
Exactly. Pack it all in one go.
What's another common mistake?
Tightly coupling your API to the data store.
Okay.
If your database structure changes, you don't want to have to rewrite the whole API.
Right, that's a nightmare.
It's like building a house on sand.
Any shift and the whole thing crumbles.
Exactly.
So you need that abstraction layer
Yes.
between the API and the data store.
So they can change independently.
Without causing a chain reaction.
Right. It goes back to that service evolution idea.
Designing APIs that can adapt
Precisely.
without breaking everything.
It's all connected.
This is all making a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad.
As we wrap up this part, I'm curious.
Yeah.
What insights from the eBook have really resonated with you?
What stands out to me is the focus on designing for humans. It's not just about the code. It's about making APIs that are intuitive, consistent, predictable.
It's about making life easier for developers and end users.
Exactly.
It's the difference between a great user experience and a frustrating one.
You nailed it.
It's recognizing that APIs aren't just technical details.
Yeah.
They're how we interact with the digital world.
And as we become more interconnected,
APIs are only becoming more important.
absolutely.
Well-designed APIs are those bridges to information and services.
I like that, bridges.
And the smoother those bridges are...
The better for everyone.
All right, before we get carried away with the bridge metaphor,
Right.
time for a quick break.
Which is good.
When we come back in part 3, we'll explore the Open API initiative
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
and wrap up our deep dive into Azure API Design.
It's been a great discussion.
Stay tuned for the grand finale. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring the world of Azure API Design.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
And you know, one thing that really stood out to me from this Azure API Design ebook was the emphasis on the Open API initiative.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like a real game changer.
I think so, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit more about why it's so important?
Well, the Open API initiative, which used to be the Swagger specification,
Right, I remember that.
it's all about bringing some standards to how we describe and document REST APIs.
Okay, so it's like establishing a common language.
Exactly.
So everyone involved can understand each other.
Yeah, it's like a universal translator for APIs.
So instead of everyone speaking their own dialect,
Right.
we now have this shared vocabulary.
Yeah, which makes collaborating so much easier.
That makes sense.
And it opens up some really cool possibilities.
Like what?
Well, imagine being able to automatically generate things like client libraries, documentation, even test cases,
Wow,
just from an API's Open API definition.
that's pretty powerful.
It is. It's the power of standardization.
So it's like having a master blueprint.
Exactly.
You can use it to build all sorts of things without starting from scratch. I remember when I first discovered Swagger,
Yeah.
it felt like magic.
It's a really useful tool.
And the Open API initiative also advocates for this contract-first approach.
That's right.
Remind me what that means again.
So that means you design the API's interface first
Okay.
before writing any code.
So it's like having a detailed plan before you start building.
Exactly, like an architectural blueprint for a house.
You figure out all the rooms, the layout.
Yeah, how everything connects.
Before you even start laying bricks.
Exactly. It prevents mistakes and rework down the line.
Just like a good architectural plan.
Nicely.
And a well-defined API contract means everyone's on the same page.
From the very beginning.
Less confusion, better collaboration.
And ultimately, more robust systems.
That makes a lot of sense.
It shifts the focus from just the code
Right.
to the essence of what the API should do
It's about being clear about the intent.
and the desired behavior right from the start.
That's incredibly valuable.
It really is.
And it all ties back to the principles of good API design we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the basics of REST to the power of the Open API initiative.
It's been a great discussion.
So, as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember
Yeah.
is that API design is about humans.
Okay.
It's about understanding the developers who will be using your API
Right.
and the end users who will be interacting with the applications built on it.
It's about empathy,
Exactly.
clarity, consistency.
And creating systems that are both technically sound and enjoyable to use.
APIs are more than just plumbing.
They really are.
They're the bridges that connect us in this digital world.
I like that analogy.
And as we become even more interconnected,
APIs will only become more important.
Absolutely. So to everyone out there building the APIs of tomorrow,
Yes.
remember these lessons.
Keep them in mind.
Think about the human beings using your APIs.
Put yourselves in their shoes.
Strive for clarity.
And don't be afraid to embrace new technologies.
The future of software is in your hands.
It's an exciting time to be building APIs.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Azure API Design.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.